microphone?
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me well.
Okay.
Does it work? So good afternoon. No? It's either on or off. I cannot play with it anymore. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to see the big audience here to speak about this controversial, I would say hot issue of European right-wing populists and their views on Islam and Israel. And usually when we send out invitations to such events of the association, the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration, this event is a part of a series with Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. People say, okay, I'm going to come, not to come, stuff like that. And here, it was the first time, in my period at least as a co-president of the association, that we actually got some comments on the issue itself. Should we call it populist? Why do we define it as populist parties? And what are we going to do? How are we going to treat Islam in this panel and other comments? So I'm looking forward to a live debate, but this will only follow the roundtable, the first roundtable that we're going to have. So without further notice, opening the event with Professor Raanan Rein, the Vice President of Tel Aviv University.
I'm not sure the microphone is working, so I'll try my best without the microphone. Shalom, good afternoon. Great pleasure in welcoming you all to this symposium devoted to European right-wing populists and their views on Islam and Israel. Populism, as we just heard, is one of the vaguest and the most elusive concepts in the modern political lexicon, since populist movements have adopted different elements in different places and different time periods, from the Russian Narodniks of the second half of the 19th century to the American populists of the 1890s, through Latin American populists all along the 20th century. This is my own field of research, and the post-World War II European populist movements as well. So there are very many differences among populist movements. However, all populist leaders have several characteristics in common. A, they see politics as a Manichaean confrontation between two antagonistic camps, the utmost good and the utmost evil. Two, they present themselves as extraordinary leaders whose mission is to liberate the people, quote unquote. Three, they pretend to speak on behalf of the people, when in fact they represent only a part of the people. Four, in order to be elected, they politicize feelings of fear or resentment. And last but not least, once in power, they attack the liberal constitutional framework of democracy that they view as constraining the will of the people. Unfortunately, in Europe and the United States, as well as here in Israel, public discourse is often characterized by xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. Liberal and democratic values should be defended in the face of challenges to pluralism and tolerance. Our mission here at Tel Aviv University is to build bridges, not to build walls. And only a couple of weeks ago, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel visited Mexico and gave a speech there, saying, among other things, that putting up walls would not solve problems caused by immigration. In this way, she was trying to challenge the US President Donald Trump. At home, Merkel has been trying to counter fears about immigration, fears of some Germans that they might face lower standards of living and a threat to their traditional cultural values due to a large number of refugees who have arrived in Germany in the past few years. A little earlier, Chancellor Merkel told Germans that they should see the arrival of thousands of migrants as an opportunity, quote unquote, and warned of divisions in German society. It is very appropriate to have this symposium here at Tel Aviv University. We are the largest and most comprehensive university in Israel, therefore the most multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary of all. We are the #1 international university in this country. But it's important to emphasize that this is not just a leading research institution, this is not just a major hub as far as innovation and entrepreneurship are concerned. It is also a university with a deep social commitment, a university which waves the banners of solidarity, pluralism, and tolerance. I would like to thank the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration and its co-presidents, my dear friend Professor Tobias, my friend and colleague Dr. Sion-Tzidkiyahu, and the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung for organizing this roundtable. I wish you all an interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
So the second reading is by Dr. Werner Puschra, who is the director of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung in Israel.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you here on this afternoon, very hot afternoon indeed. On behalf of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, this seminar takes place in cooperation with the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration, a long-standing partner of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, and we are very happy that we were able to put this discussion round up still after the closure of the semester and before the really hot season starts in Israel. And thank you very much for everyone for coming here and joining us. I see there's quite considerable interest in the topic, so this is great. And as Raanan just said, I mean, it is a difficult topic to deal with. Populism is not really well defined. And I just hope that the keynote speakers will be able to shed some more light. So, without further ado, I want to thank you very much and give the floor back to Mike.
Okay, so on behalf of the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration, I hope it will. Yeah, but can you all hear me? Yeah. Well, okay, excellent. So on behalf of the Association for the Study of European Integration, and the last greeter of this event, I do want to focus a little bit more about the European Union and its relations to this issue of populist, far-right, extreme political parties. In the past few years, the European Union has been in a pluri-crisis situation. All of these crises are to some extent related, some more and some a bit less, but all of them are related to the rise of more extreme right-wing political parties in Europe. Obviously, this is a phenomenon which Israel and Jewish and Muslim communities in Europe are following closely. To begin the last list of crises, we can begin talking about the integration process itself, as rising Euro skepticism and other call by those populist parties against the European Union itself. And we can start talking about this phenomena already from the 1990s, but more closely in the last bit more than a decade, about the French and the Dutch people who in a referendum in 2005, in May and in June 2005, decided to not ratify the constitutional treaty. This is to some extent part of Euroscepticism. European Union is being blamed for taking sovereignty away from the national member states and moving it to Brussels, and also eroding national identity. So the first part, taking sovereignty, is of course to some extent true, but eroding national sovereignty is not really the aim or the goal of European Union. On the contrary, it has been blamed. The European Union has been blamed for its democratic deficit, which, again, to some extent, this is very much true. Taking decisions in Brussels away from the citizens, and the list of allegations against the European Union by those parties is very, very long, and I won't go into it. So this is one crisis. The integration process itself is promoting right-wing populist parties across Europe. And we can start talking about the other crises. So the debt crisis was the first one. The economic crisis was a global one, but the debt crisis was a very specific European one that brought much more economic hardship, and we all know that history teaches us that those are the times that makes those right-wing parties much more successful in their elections campaigns. The debt crisis brought with it a lot of economic and social hardship, rising unemployment in Europe, especially among the young voters. And we see that the people who are left behind by globalization, that are blaming the European Union for not being able to protect them from this globalization as one of the crises that make Euroscepticism even harder as a trend. The immigration crisis that we saw 2 years ago, just in the summer of 2015, where over 1 million immigrants, refugees coming into Europe was a big push for those right-wing parties being able to manipulate the fears in Europe. So that is another crisis that has to do with populist parties in Europe. We see terror attacks that has to do with European citizens, but they are second or third or even fourth generation for Muslim origin usually, being trained by ISIS. So again, we see another rise in the last few years of a lot of terrorist attacks that has also, to some extent, rightly so, making all those manipulations on the fears of the population. And we see Brexit, the last crisis that the EU is suffering from, that has also to do with the very specific populist right-wing political party that has almost no representation in the House of Commons, but was able to shift the agenda and take a country, a member state of the European Union outside, or in the process of going outside the European Union. And suddenly we speak not about the European Union, but about disintegration, not about integration, but disintegration. And in 2014, and again in 2016, we see in the European Parliament for the first time a political party, political group of the European Parliament that is being composed by those right-wing populist parties headed by Marine Le Pen. We have there are 40 MEPs, members of the European Parliament, who belong to this political party. Half of them are from the Front National. We have Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, members of the party in that political group, and many others from 8 or 9 member states. So this all comes together. We have discussed throughout the year a lot of these pluri-crises, different aspects of different crises of the European integration. We come to the last one of them, which I think again takes a lot of attention here in Israel. So to wrap up things, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the aims of the association, to invite you to become a member, either of the association itself. You can join us either through me or Professor Tobias or through the website that we have. That was just mentioned beforehand. What the association tries to do is to promote the discussion and critical discussion in Israel about different aspects of European integration and to some extent its relations to Israel. I think this is probably one of the issues that has to do a lot with Israel, and I'm glad to see a distinguished representatives from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here with us. So thank you for coming. And last, but definitely not least, I want to thank the Aviv University for hosting us, for helping us to organize the event, and of course the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung for having this joint partnership with the association and helping us to have this space. So now, we are moving to the keynote lecture of this evening. And the keynote lecture that we're having is by Dr. Werner Puschra and Clara Hestermann from Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. Do you have any presentation?
So thank you very much, Maya. And now we come to hopefully more substantive part.
Can't hear you.
You can't hear it?
No.
You hear better. You hear better.
Behind the door, there's you can adjust the volume.
So without the mic?
No.
No. With mic?
Perhaps
Better?
you just have in the
I need to have it closer to my mouth. Anyway, so thank you very much, Maya, and for the introduction. So we start with this beautiful picture where you see people. Yes, thank you. Where you see people who represent the future of Europe. At least that's what they think. So they are representatives of right-wing populist parties in Europe. The lady on the right-hand side is Frau Petri from the Alternative for Germany. In the middle of the lady is Marine Le Pen. And next to her is Geert Wilders from the Netherlands. And we will touch in the presentation on the two case studies, the Netherlands and France. We will leave out the Alternative for Germany because Tobias is dealing with them more in depth than we were able to do in the 20 minutes which are assigned to us. So this is where we start, and I would like to introduce my junior research assistant, Clara Hestermann, and I want to thank her very much for all the work she put into this. The floor is now yours.
Thank you. Before I hand back the mic to you, I want to talk about the outline of this presentation. First, as we already heard, the phenomenon of populism is very controversial, and we need to define, before we start talking about it, we certainly need to define what we are actually talking about when we talk about populism, about right-wing populism, and what it differentiates from right-wing extremism. And that's what Werner is going to talk about, and also to explain how we understand populist rhetoric, strategies, enemy stereotypes, and what's actually the electoral successes in Europe of these right-wing populist parties. And after that, I will talk about two examples, the Netherlands and France, to analyze the relationship of these parties with Israel and their views on Islam. And then we come to a quick summary.
Yes, thank you very much, Clara. Clara joined us 3 months ago, so thank you very much for doing it. But unfortunately, your time comes to an end soon. Probably today. So, so let's start with the definitions, and let's try to approach the phenomenon of populism. Okay. So, what is populism? Because a lot can be said about it, and we need to discuss it because it's still uncharted ground to a large degree, actually. Populism is responding to and fueling fears and worries which people have and among people. It uses people's fears for political purposes. It offers very simplified solutions, black and white, political, right and left, and it follows a certain scheme in their messages. So first, they say there's a huge problem. Secondly, the second step of the explanation is this problem cannot be solved by the existing political parties, the system, the elites. And third step is we are the only ones who can solve it. So this is more or less the three-step approach they are following. So, sorry, I'm still struggling with the terminology. So here you see they define themselves as we the people, although they not necessarily have a mandate to say so. And again, we the people against the elites, because the elites are the ones who are leading us in the wrong direction. They are taking the wrong decisions, not listening to us at all. So we the people are the ones who really know what needs to be done and how to do it. So, and of course, they define themselves, we the people, versus the elites, but also against all others, foreigners, aliens, strangers. So they say we are the people, we are German people, for example, in the case of the alternative for Germany, and all the others are against us and against the elites. So what is right-wing extremism? So it's anti-democratic. Their ideology is racially or ethnically triggered, and they focus on the social differences. They claim and want ethnic homogeneity within the nations of the world. They reject the idea of equality of all human beings. They define group identities, and group identities are more important than individual identities and individual rights, and the state has to be above the citizens. They reject pluralism of values and multiculturalism. So very often they have one strong leader, male or female, and tend towards a more authoritarian or authoritarian political system, also within their own party, running their own parties and groups. They favor nationalism, oppose European integration, and also economic globalization. They are xenophobic, racist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, anti-American. So you find all bad things here combined very often, but in different expressions among those right-wing extremist populist parties. They favor the national economy against globalization. They promote the idea of friend-foe dichotomy, so everyone who's not a friend is a foe. And very often you also find them denial Nazism and the Holocaust, which is coupled often with historical revisionism, as you may see later on when we discuss concrete case studies. So, the characteristics. They use proactive demagogic slogans, say we need to break so-called taboos against politically correct language. They use simplifications, very often exaggerations. The leader is presented as a man or a woman of the people. They speak of constant threats of different kinds to the nation and to the people. They argue very emotionally, play with emotions. They emphasize traditions and are against modernism and enlightenment. They very often use common sense arguments. Their main modes of communication are the yellow press and more so the social media nowadays. And the social media, which you may have access or not, but it's a very different way of communication with the people other than traditional media we normally would use. The media is very often lying. Traditional media, you hear it very often from leading politicians from around the world, now especially one. yeah, they see themselves as victims, as outsiders, as losers of the present system set up and the present political society set up. For them, life is a constant fight, and intellectuals are not to be trusted because they have sometimes very strange ideas. So, who are their enemies? It's the establishment, the political elites. In the case of the European populists, it's the Euro bureaucracy. You have immigrants, ethnic pluralism, is any multiculturalism, Islam, Jews, the state of Israel, and her behavior towards the Palestinians, which is often compared also with the Holocaust. So you find again this mixture, very strange sometimes, of enemy stereotypes among them. So coming to the electoral successes, you see here some countries with the respective figures. So they are quite relevant. Let's start with Germany. We'll later on. This is the figures from the last elections. 4.7% they got. So that means they did not make it into the German Bundestag. But the next elections, end of September, may mean that we also will have the alternative for Germany represented in the German Bundestag. So far they stand at around 8%, but with a falling trend, actually. So this is also interesting to note. Then you see some other countries, even Finland and Sweden. We are supposed to be very democratic countries, very social democratic countries, even socially minded. You have a high percentage of right-wing populists in Denmark as well, Netherlands and so on. Switzerland, 30%. So this gives you a quick picture of the electoral successes. Here you have now a number of more countries. So you see almost in every country, you find right-wing populist movements and parties, and they participate in elections and have some electoral results and successes as well. There are two interesting exceptions, which is Spain and Portugal. So I do not know why exactly. Maybe you can give us some more information. My assumption simply is that because of the very recent experiences with military dictatorship in both countries, this may immunize people to vote for another extremism. But it can also be that the political scenery and setup is very polarized in both countries, additionally, so that there's a clear choice, which is not necessarily the choice of populist parties. Now I'm finished with my part. I managed in 7 minutes, and now it's Clara. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So before I start giving the two examples of the Netherlands and France, I want to outline some general principles in Israel's relationship to the right-wing populists in Europe. And first of all, we can talk of two unwritten rules for contacts with European right-wing populists. And this kind of context can only emerge when there's firstly a recognition of this European party by local Jewish communities, and secondly, if this party went through a kind of reappraisal of their own anti-Semitic Nazi past. Then of course we can ask, why would there even be interest from Israeli side in contacts with this kind of parties? And I think we see that in the bad relationship between Israel and Europe, which clearly mirrors the fact that the Israeli government doesn't really see partners in the governing mainstream parties in Europe. So they're looking for new partners who unconditionally support Israel and the Israeli policies, and especially the settlement policy, as we all know, which is, as we all know, very criticized internationally and especially in Europe. And of course, they also seek influence within institutions of the European Union, which also makes sense when we think about the fact that most of these right-wing populist parties are more represented within the European Parliament than actually in national parliaments. However, this is not left uncommented. There are critical voices in some Jewish diaspora communities, and also President Rein has expressed his criticism of this approachment towards right-wing populists. So now to the Netherlands. I won't talk much about the history of this party. As I think we all know, it didn't become the strongest party in this March elections, unlike it was predicted to be, but it didn't become the strongest party. And it is led by Geert Wilders, who's also the only member of the party. The program is mostly very strongly anti-Islamic. Wilders demands shutting down mosques and to ban the Quran in the Netherlands because he compares it to Hitler's Mein Kampf. He says that there is more anti-Semitism in the Quran than in Mein Kampf. And he describes Islam as an ideology, not a religion, but an ideology of hate and violence and intolerance. Also, the program is anti-immigration. It's against Dutch membership in the European Union, and it promotes direct democracy. Then, of course, keeping in mind the two unwritten rules, we must ask, is this party anti-Semitic? And surprisingly, unlike most European right-wing parties, it does not have any anti-Semitic past. On the contrary, Wilders has very strong ties to Israel. As a young man, he spent 2 years in a kibbutz in Israel, and since then he has developed his anti-Islam rhetoric and a very strong pro-Israel rhetoric. He has described Israel on several occasions as a canary in the coal mine and the West's first line of defense against Islam. So he sees Israel as a kind of a role model for how to deal with Islam, a role model for Europe. And he also supports claiming all the land between Jordan and the Mediterranean for Israel. So he strongly supports the settlement policies, as we can see in this tweet, which he wrote as a reaction to the passing of Resolution 2334 in last December. There was a change in policy towards Wilders. Until 2009, the Israeli government used to refuse public and high-level contacts with Wilders, but under then Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman, this changed. He received Wilders in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and since then he's been a welcome guest here. Now, because I think I'm running out of time, I'm coming to France and the Front National, which was founded in 1972 by Jean-Marie Le Pen, and in 2011, as I think we all know, the leadership was handed over to his daughter, Marine Le Pen, who unsuccessfully ran for president this year, but made some big successes in other elections. The program is mostly nationalist, anti-immigration, anti-elites, against the European Union and French membership in the European Union as it is now. It promotes economic protectionism, law and order policies, and it is anti-Islamic. And the pictures here that are taken from the website of the Front National, I think they show how the Front National is using fears to promote their political purposes, the fear of foreign intervention for the European Union and the fear of a takeover of the Islamic State, of France through the Islamic State. Then, of course, the question, is it anti-Semitic? Under Jean-Marie Le Pen, the answer would have been clearly yes, anti-Semitic, racist, machine-nostalgic, and neo-fascist. He has been repeatedly convicted for minimizing or denying the Holocaust. But since 2011, Marine Le Pen has applied a policy of dédiabolisation, meaning she tried to ban all anti-Semitic and neo-fascist elements from the party, and this even led to the expulsion of Jean-Marie in August of 2015. In the picture here, we can also see how she tried to distance herself from her family name, Le Pen, and she only campaigned as Marine for the presidency. She herself has never made any clearly anti-Semitic statements. However, it must be clear that the party is not completely free of anti-Semitism. On different levels, but even in the highest level among Marine Le Pen's advisors, there are people who clearly hold anti-Semitic views. And also, we can say that the dependency on her father still continues, as he gave her a $6 million loan for the presidential campaign. From Israeli side, the official government policy is to to boycott the Front National because of its anti-Semitic past and partly the present. And again, keeping in mind the two unwritten rules, the Representative Council of French Jewish Institutions continuously rejects any affiliations of Jewish organizations with the Front National. However, support of the Front National among French Jews is rising, mainly because of fears of anti-Semitism among French Muslims and the idea that the Front National is the only party who can really protect them from this kind of anti-Semitism. And on an unofficial level, there's also a rapprochement. In January of this year, the Secretary General, Nicolas Bey, visited Israel and met with several representatives of the Likud party. In the picture that Nicolas Bey tweeted, he's seen with the president of the Young Likud, David Shayan. And in this quote that I took from the New York Times, we can clearly see what's the strategy behind this rapprochement, namely to distance the Front National from anti-Semitism. And the second quote that is taken from the right-wing blog Breitbart News, he openly shows that that the idea is basically to sell the same product under a different name. Voting for the Front National is not anymore anti-Muslim, but it's actually protecting Jews from Muslim anti-Semitism. And that's it about the Front National, and we have a short summary. We have time for that? So to summarize the whole thing, we can see the rise of right-wing populists as a pan-European phenomenon. They are mainly united by an anti-Muslim agenda. The pro-Israel attitude is used as a legitimization for the European electorate. Israel is often seen as a role model in dealing with Islam, as we saw with Wilders. Anti-Semitic views continue to exist, but are shown less obvious, as we could see with the Front National. And Israel, on the other hand, is in search for right-wing European supporters of Israeli government policies, and all in all, the Israeli official government policy to boycott European populist right-wingers is in the process of being abandoned.
Basis of what?
On the basis of that members of the governing party are trying to approach these right-wingers.
Thank you, Clara and Werner. I invite now the panelists to come and sit with us. So unlike usual conferences, we are short on time, so I would not read you the short bio of the speakers. Each speaker has been given 7 minutes to talk on his issue. We aimed to bring different voices here to the table that are dealing with Europe, are dealing with Israel, also with the formal position of Israel, of the government, of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of the Jewish communities, and more independent voices that call maybe to question Israel's policy. So we are beginning with Edan. Edan, would you want to use the microphone? Should I bring it over to you?
Sure.
Okay. Edan is in a program called Mr., but he's actually on his way to receive his PhD very, very short. So he's here from the Tel Aviv University, and his PhD was dealing with right-wing parties.
Thank you. So I kind of want to take a breath for a second. With all of the images and sounds over the past months and years, Trump, Brexit, Le Pen, and all of the backlashes on the other side of that, the responses from Islamic terrorist organizations and extremists from that direction as well. I think it's very easy to want to kind of group this all as one phenomenon. And in many ways it is, and I personally also buy into that, and I'll talk about that at the end of my few minutes. But at the same time, we should also recognize that there is much variation in just calling the parties what we think they are. I mean, if we just look at the conference program we have, and from the previous lectures and discussions, we have extremism, we have populism, right-wing, radical, and these words mean very different things. So that's kind of the main point of my talk. I will focus on lessons learned in the literature on the European phenomenon, but I will also try to mix in and draw conclusions or implications towards the Israeli case as well, not only because my research kind of navigates both contexts, but also, as we saw from the last lecture, and as I believe someone will talk about later in the panel, I mean, if we are to start observing the relationship between European right-wing parties and Israeli right-wing parties, then we should also see, first of all, I guess, if these units are even compatible or comparable. So my talk will include 5 aspects of the ideology of these radical right parties that I'll briefly touch on. I will focus on the ambiguities and confusions in the literature and also in practice. I will try as much as possible to relate to actual parties. So the first aspect of the ideology that's been discussed is this idea of radical. Now, I'm not going to go into a very big discussion on what radicalism actually means. There is also a lot of confusion about what the term means by itself, but if we take it as meaning extremism, basically. So there is a big issue, as I see it, in calling all such parties extreme right-wing parties or extreme parties. It doesn't do justice to the fact that over the course of the post-war period, we have had many election cycles and many instances in which mainstream parties adopt this kind of ideology. Through my research, I've noticed that the de Gaulle ideology, for example, in the early post-war years can be called what I call nativist parties, and I'll talk about that in a second. We have other instances of mainstream parties. If we look at Israel, for example, the Likud, a mainstream party. I mean, we can also, I'll talk about whether they fit into this model, but we can see fluctuations in the ideology and the extremity on some of these issues that mainstream parties take. Equally, we should also be looking at the fact that some niche parties that have been commonly called radical right-wing or extreme right-wing moderate their policies over time. If we look, for example, at the Lega Nord in Italy, which is traditionally and commonly accepted as a radical right-wing parties, there have been instances following certain election cycles and certain government coalitions in which they've moderated their policy agenda. They've shifted from attacking immigrants to attacking the EU. So this idea of calling all these parties extremist or radical, if you want to use that term, is a bit problematic. Secondly, this idea of right, left, is also a little bit misleading. In many cases, for example, in the case of such parties in Scandinavia, they have very left-wing policies when it comes to economics, for example. In the 1980s, many such parties had a very neoliberal economic platforms. So this idea of calling these parties radical right-wing or right-wing parties is also a bit problematic, and we have to be very careful about which aspects of their ideology we want to focus on. Excuse me. Thirdly, this hot topic, this big term, populism, which is probably the most commonly discussed term up until today in the session so far. If we look at the literature of the social sciences, populism is most traditionally defined as actually a form of procedural democracy. It's very commonly, I believe, misused in the literature on the new radical right as being basically equated with nativism, us versus them. If you look at the actual literature on populism, it's talking about actually opening up the democratic process. Really, in practice, populism is having a form of direct democracy. Where I do agree, though, with what was said earlier, is that while some of these parties may be populist and may want to open up the democratic process to the people, of course their definition of the people is very narrow. It's not, in fact, the whole population. It's for a narrow, very narrow aspect of that population. So this idea of populism is also a bit misleading and should be noticed. Fourthly, when we talk about fascism, fascism is another word that is often thrown around when we talk about these parties. Many parties, in fact, do find their organizational and ideological roots in fascism and even neo-Nazism in many cases. But probably by now the vast majority of them have formally even denounced fascism and Nazism as part of their agenda. In fact, as part of their campaigns and their electoral and policy agendas, they participate in and fight for the survival of the democratic system. So to call them fascism or authoritarianism is not correct anymore. Finally, the aspect of the ideology that is a common thread among most of these parties, all of them if you ask me and many other scholars, is this idea of what I call nativism. Really this, we could call it nationalism if you'd like, that's a more common term. It's this idea of making distinguishing between different types of people. Now the accepted version of this is looking at it from an ethnic perspective. Europeans versus non-Europeans, Christians versus Muslims, Jews versus Arabs or Muslims in the case of Israel. This is also a bit misleading because when you look at the data, it's not really about the population. It's not really about the number of immigrants coming into society, coming into the country. Based on my research, and I think if you look at what's going on, especially if you want to compare Europe to Israel, it's really about institutions. It comes down to who has control over the institution-making bodies of the nation state, sovereignty, if you will. It comes down to who is the beneficiary of these institutions, whether we're talking about the welfare state, whether we're talking about political institutions. And my time is running out, so I'll try to summarize quickly. And I think this is really the most valuable lesson. If we do look at nativism from an institutional perspective, rather than specific religions or specific demographics, then I think we can catch many more parties here. We can bring in the European Union to the equation, and it's also much more relevant to Israel, which I'm happy to talk about more in the discussion.
Thank you, Edan. And we're moving to Dr. Gisela Dachs from the DAAD Center for German Studies and the European Forum at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And I forgot to mention the title of Edan Raviv, but if you haven't noticed so far, it was clarifying European bodies like Right and its relevance for Israel. And we'll come back definitely to the relevance of Israel after the presentation. And Gisela will speak about nationalists of all countries reunite. Please.
Well, first of all, I would say about this, where to put the limit between radicalism, extremism, and populism. I think that the main problem is that the boundaries are very much blurred. And I also would make a distinction between voters. There can be all kind of voters who just go for, they try to turn their back on classical established party systems, and party representatives. And I think we have everything even inside the same parties. I mean, I will focus mainly on the populist parties. We have spoken about Netherlands, France, Austria, Germany. And there's an interesting phenomenon. We have a kind of a globalization of the nationalists, or you could also say anti-globalists trying to go global. And which is, well, the question is whether this is really so new, but one can say 2017 remains the year where right-wing populists entered together election campaigns almost everywhere in Europe, in the West and in Eastern Europe, in the States too, in a way. And in the past, they were reluctant to go together. I mean, the picture Werner Puschra had just shown us was a quite interesting one, because they in the past, they helped each other occasionally, but now much more systematically. For the first time, there was this meeting, as we have seen, of all these three leaders together last January. So Le Pen, Wilders, and Frauke Petry, which, if one would want so, you could call this the foundation of the international right-wing populist parties. And they themselves might not like the title of populism here. If we speak about common strategies, one could call them to let ideas sink in, to have an imitation of strategies in direct cooperation, using social medias and alternative media online outlets. One good example is when Macron was just running for the second round. If you remember well, there was just this moment where there was a leak of many documents about his past, and it was not clear what was in these documents, and the French press said, no, we won't, I mean, we're not allowed to publish anything, it was too close to the elections. You had in the States right-wing, extreme right-wing publications who were leaking the information. So here you have a clear link how, you know, helping each other out in other spheres, how this could work. But so far, there were also big differences among these people. Wilders, as we have seen, who in public supports Jews, took distance in the past at least from Marine Le Pen. Frauke Petry from the Alternative for Germany also didn't like Le Front National. And as we have just heard, it's very interesting on economic issues. Frauke Petry is in favor of neoliberal economies, unlike the Front National, who wishes for a stronger state intervention. Which there, when it comes to economies, there was recently a Bertelsmann report where they said, is the right the new left, economically in France? So you have really here a new redefinition of right and left in that sense. But, and these studies have shown this in the past, if you have these three grievances, saying you have the model of immigration as the most important grievance addressed by these parties. You have economic changes and complaints about elitist and corrupt politics. What the studies have shown that the economic change and corruption in politics is contributed to the explanation of the rise of popular right vote in some countries, but there was only one issue where this was really successful mobilized, and this was immigration. So if you want, in a way, what really unites this together, this is really this mobilization, this politics of insecurity, of fears, is really anti-Islam front. Also, another interesting point, all these three leaders, they all visited Putin within 3 months in the first few months of this year. So also the Front National took a loan in 2014 from a Russian bank. Representatives of the Austrian FPÖ went 2014 to be elections observer on the Crimea, and they helped, in fact, to legitimize a Russian claim for the island. One just reminiscence of the past. I mean, is such an alliance really new? And well, we know, and so far we don't know where this goes, but in a way that nationalists have kind of a borderless cooperation is not completely new. In the 1920s and 1930s, Europe's fascists united to Fascist International, which always sounds like some inner contradiction. It was then without Germany, and then later Germany and Italy became allies, and after Mussolini came to power in 1922 in Italy, he had visits from all over Europe. Militias were formed on this model. Mussolini's party sent money to Great Britain, delivered weapons to Austria, and trained Croatian militias. 2 decades this went on and well, and in fact, what did unite them? Hatred for a common enemy, also in order to hide inner contradiction, and the enemies were Jews and foreigners, liberal democracy, and communists. So if you say today what unites this nationalist thinking, you can say, well, it's hatred mainly of Muslim immigrants. It's also gender ideology, politically correctness, feminist movements, and the so-called elites. So you have different ideological profiles, but the heart of the program is identical everywhere. Well, as we have heard, it's talking in the name of the common will of a people with a common descent. I think this is very important, the ethnic component. Marine Le Pen did talk about privileges for ethnic French citizens in comparison to migrant citizens, so the national culture is very important. And I'd like just for my last minute to mention, and here we go maybe a bit far to the right, while the more moderate populist parties try to get a stamp of legitimacy by having contacts with Jews, with Israel, by saying, well, you see, we're not anti-Semitic, you have also really different kind of people. And there was, in Germany, there's this website, Politically Incorrect, and they organized a trip to Israel with their people. So they had people members from the Alternative for Germany with them, and I'm just going to quote you what they were looking for. There was a journalist who infiltrated himself in this trip and was listening to what they were saying and what they were also writing in their emails. So they came here, in fact, out of enthusiasm for Israel, and one of the participants said, I mainly want to be together in Israel with people who have my thinking. And I'm mainly interested by urban warfare. What we can learn there, we can use it against the invaders in our home country. So just to give you the broad picture, it's all in one pot, and this is not really reassuring. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gisela. We are moving to Dr. Tobias Ebbrecht-Hartmann, who is also from the DAAD Center for German Studies and European Forum at the Hebrew University. And he will address us regarding the populist far right in Germany and Austria, strategies, rhetorics, ideology.
Thank you very much. Yes, I will mainly focus on Germany and Austria here. I start with the year 2010. That year, Patrick Brinkmann, a German-Swedish businessman and supporter of far-right extremist parties in Germany, proclaimed the emergence of a non-anti-Semitic German far-right, which should act as a protector of Jewish life in Europe. In the same year, Hans-Christian Strache, chairman of the Austrian far-right Freedom Party, visited Israel and issued, together with other far-right European party leaders, the so-called Jerusalem Declaration that pictured a world-wide struggle against Islamic fundamentalism, which they wanted to join alongside Israel in its fight against terrorism. Did these developments mark a change in the European and especially German and Austrian far-right's worldview? Did the anti-Islamic and anti-Muslim policy of these parties finally crow over their anti-Semitic tradition? Lately, as we heard, also Germany witnessed the rise of a far right-wing party, the Alternative for Germany, which seems to effectively successful at the electorate. And the party's co-chair, we heard about her, Frauke Petri, visited Israel last year and also declared her sympathy with the Jewish state. Indeed, while the anti-Islamic rhetoric of the AfD intensified since the so-called refugee crisis in 2015 and replaced earlier, mainly Eurosceptical statements, openly anti-Semitic views seem to be exceptional cases. But a closer look reveals that far-right's sympathy for Israel, and I would say also in case of the Front National and Gerd Wilders' party, is nothing else than a tactical solidarity. Brinkmann, for instance, angrily attacked the German Central Council for the Jews in Germany as worst supporters of radical Islam after they rejected his offer for cooperation. And such frustration clearly shows how anti-Semitic elements reappear because of this frustration and disappointment. And indeed, Brinkmann accused the German Jews themselves to promote Islamism, which is seen by right populists as the dangerous threat for the European identity. The FPÖ, for example, added a special appendix to the Jerusalem Declaration in which they emphasized Austrian neutrality and explicitly referred to legendary Austrian social democratic and Jewish Chancellor Bruno Kreisky, who is famous and well known for his pro-Palestinian policy. And part of the Jerusalem Declaration is also the right for a homeland, which should be protected and achieved for all people. And this sentence is clearly written for the parts of the party which are which still support national liberation movements, including the PLO. So, although anti-Islamic and anti-Muslim policy is one of the most important glues for far-right ideologies today, I would say that FPÖ and AfD are far from being anti-Islamic parties. In accordance with huge parts of the new European far-right, their alarmist proclamation of an upcoming population exchange in Europe and the replacement of Europeans by Muslims is not part of a policy directed against Islam, but against Muslim immigrants in European countries. Basically, they agree with Islamist attempts to politically define Islam as a geopolitical force, and this is based on Carl Schmitt's theory that the world is divided into different spheres of dominance, and political Islam is perceived by these right-wing parties as a justified power, but only in their particular sphere, while at the same time Muslims are not welcomed in the ancestral European sphere. However, some far-right protagonists also reveal the close interplay of anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic elements. For example, they state that the Muslims are the threat for the Europeans, but they also state that there are some unidentified powers behind this threat who intend to replace and thereby eliminate the European people. And some members of the AfD revealed who they expect to drive Muslims to Europe, for example, liberal Jewish philanthropists such as George Soros, or they also accuse other so-called super-rich who benefit from globalization and destroy their homeland, such as Rothschild and Rockefeller. So it's, I think, clear that conspiracy theories, which are also part of anti-Semitic worldviews, are a significant part of the far-right's ideology. It's important to mention that anti-Semitism today, at least in Europe, is not directly expressed. It's always expressed in a coded way. So Jews do not need to be mentioned explicitly. Thereby it's possible, of course, just to use significant keywords in order to make sure for the electorate who these parties are referring to without being explicitly anti-Semitic. So to summarize, the populist far-right's tactical solidarity with Israel benefits, in my view, from several shortcomings in the political struggle with anti-Semitism on the one hand and Islamism on the other. They benefit from the fact that often coded anti-Semitism is not seen as such, and so they can address their specific strategy of using anti-Semitic resentments without explicitly mentioning Jews. Second, they benefit from the negative attitude towards Israel, especially in Europe, because Israel is singled out by politicians and the media. They can present themselves as ally for Israel because of common enemies, and we have to keep in mind that these enemies are not only Muslims but also the media, which they coin as lying press and established parties. So therefore, I think it should be definitely necessary to review also the Middle East policy in Europe, especially in regard to populism, which unfortunately was addressed mainly by social democratic politicians in the last years. Third, many European governments avoid dealing with the threats of Islamist terrorism and Muslim anti-Semitism. Especially problematic is still the use of the so-called Islamophobia. The term is coined in order to compare it with anti-Semitism, although it's a clearly Islamist term which was developed after the Iranian revolution and is used by Islamist groups to avoid a critical reflection of Islam and its liberalization. So it's mainly used as a concept against Muslims themselves, but it also avoids the necessary debates, and the far-right politicians benefit from this. Fourth, politicians in Israel think that the far-right might be a potential ally, although they clearly sympathize with Islamist regimes like Iran in case of the FPÖ, They are close allied with Russia, as we heard, which supports many of Israel's sworn enemies in the region. Groups like the AfD are completely against preserving the memory of the Holocaust in Germany, and do also so-called Holocaust inversion. So they attack a fundamental element of Israeli identity and also of Jewish life in the diaspora by attacking religious rituals like religious slaughter or circumcision, which are addressed against Muslims, but of course also attack Jews. Just as a final sentence, I want to mention that a study by the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung in 2016 showed that the electorate of the AfD did not only express the highest rate of traditional anti-Semitic resentments, 19%, but also 47% of the AfD voters clearly voiced the highest rate of Israel-related anti-Semitism. So I think these parties cannot be potential allies for Israel.
Thank you very much, Tobias. And we're moving to Mr. Akiva, who is the director of the Bureau for World Jewish Affairs and World Religions at the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he will speak to us about the growth of the far right in Europe and the safety of the Jewish communities, the position of Israel. Please.
So, thank you. I'll begin with an analysis of the situation, then I'll move to a statement of Israel's formal position. Israel finds itself in a unique position vis-a-vis the parties of the far right. Our company is avidly pursued by a number of these parties. They claim to purge themselves of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic culture. They claim to have a unique understanding of Israel's predicament in the Middle East and in a larger civilizational conflict. And they claim to be dumbfounded by Israel's reticence or unwillingness to embrace them, given Israel's diplomatic dilemmas in Europe and the perceived hostility towards Israel of the EU. The reason for this is because it is clear to official Israel what is happening. Israel is in essence being asked by these parties to issue a kosher stamp. Because even Israel's detractors know that Israel plays a special role in Europe, in the European system, and in European culture. Number one, as a canary in the mine against anti-Semitism. But also Israel is perceived as playing a special role in politics in blocking the return of anti-liberal tendencies to Europe. In fact, this is the exact reason why Israel must be so cautious in weighing its position vis-a-vis these parties, and lest we make a mistake. Not only because of Israel's moral character or moral self-understanding as a Jewish and democratic state, not only because of our need to support the Jewish communities in Europe who feel threatened by these parties, but because we could, God forbid, inadvertently enable one of these parties to get to political power in Europe if we make a misstep. This problem comes up in particular regarding the FPO in Austria, which is closest among the parties of entering government, and hence it is the party in Europe which pursues Israel most actively. A few words about the position of the Jewish community. How does Israel have to relate to the position of the Jewish communities in Europe? Well, we don't, ipso facto, we don't by definition have to accept every position of the Jewish community. Witness Israel's arguments now with North American Jewry over the quota. However, but regarding the issue in Europe, we have a different position about that. First of all, we view the Jewish communities in Europe as having very deep insight regarding what is going on to their countries, and an insight which we would be wise to listen to, number one. Number two is the effects of the elections in Europe affect these Jewish communities directly. Therefore, their position has a stronger claim on the Israeli foreign policy than is normally the case in our relationship with Jewish communities. I would like to say also that beyond this issue, also just from the standpoint of political calculation, it would not be wise for Israel to embrace the parties of the far right. Even if we put the moral calculations aside or the interests of the Jewish communities aside, Israel's doing it would cause Israel to pay a heavy diplomatic price right now vis-a-vis the parties who are in power and who may well remain in power. That's number one. And number two, if something would happen, and if one of these parties would achieve power in one of the governments, they would still require Israel's kosher stamp in order to receive international legitimacy. So we're in the strange situation where it's not only right to do the right thing, but it's also wise to do the right thing, because Israel will gain very little from embracing these parties, and if, God forbid, they would achieve power, we could rethink our policy afterwards. They would still need us. We also have to be very careful regarding talk of benchmarks or entering into some sort of dialogue with a party like the FPO or FN regarding what would be required in us in order for us to formulate a engagement with them, or formal engagement with them, because any form of establishing benchmarks actually means to enter into a dialogue with them, into a negotiation with them, and then in which case Israel would find itself as a front runner and far ahead of any of our like-minded friends in Europe, England, France, Germany, regarding these parties, which is a place where we don't want to be. We want to be last in line, not front in line. So now I'd like to say a few words regarding our formal policy. We divide the parties roughly, the far-right parties in Europe, roughly into three kinds of categories. There are parties which have the characteristics or are essentially neo-Nazi parties, more or less. Here I would group Jobbik in Hungary, Golden Dawn in Greece, and PD in Germany. With these parties, the State of Israel will not have any relations, whether they are out of government or whether they are in government. We will not speak to them. Parties that have a Nazi or fascist historic past and which today exhibit signs of racism or anti-Semitism within their political culture, even if they deny it. Here, these kind of parties are parties like the National Front in France, the Freedom Party in Austria, AfD in Germany, and the Swedish Democrats. So Israel's policy is to, we do not maintain official relations with these parties, and not at the level of diplomats, not at the level of our ambassadors, not at the level of lower level diplomats as well. We do not stop them from entering Israel, but if they come to Israel on their own, we do not receive them. Israel also will not enter into a process of engagement or setting benchmarks with these parties. And Israel will not begin any sort of negotiation with these parties without some sort of prior, if we were to do it for some reason, we would certainly talk or speak to the local Jewish community beforehand. If one of these parties wins an election and becomes a lead coalition partner, then we will have to reconsider our policy. Our tendency, however, will be to be behind the like-minded, or last in line to engage with these parties and not first in line. That brings us to parties which are populist, but do not have a fascist past, but they may be racist. So here we have parties such as Geert Wilders in Holland, VVD in Belgium, UKIP in Britain. Each of these parties we look at differently, and we don't see them really as one group. Each party, we will formulate our policy according to our analysis of the party specifically, the internal situation in that country, and the way this party is understood by the like-minded and by the mainstream parties in that country. With Wilders, we struggle, because Wilders comes from the Liberal Party, doesn't have a fascistic past, and he loves Israel. So we struggle with this, but it is not correct to say that we receive him at the high level. It may have happened in the past, but it's not our current practice. We don't boycott him, but if he comes to Israel, he does not visit inside the foreign ministry, and he does not meet with ministers. I'd like to say just a few words regarding something which appeared in the presentation, the keynote presentation, which I thought was excellent until the last couple lines. I don't think that you can give, if an FN person comes and insinuates themselves into a meeting with the chief medical officer of the IDF, or of the Secretary General of the Kibbutz movement, or even the head of Young Likud, it does not imply or in any way indicate a change in the Israeli policy. it simply means that that person who received that person did not do very, very fundamental homework about what it means to hold a work meeting with such a person. And indeed, it is not indicative of any change. I do not believe that Israel is about to abandon its policies. I believe, if anything, our policy is deepening. Thank you.
We're moving to Dr. Lawrence Weinbaum from the World Jewish Congress and Israel Council of Foreign Relations, and he would speak to us about the European Jewry and the ascendancy of the European right.
First of all, can you hear me without the microphone? Yeah. I prefer not to use the microphone if that's possible, just my own idiosyncrasy. First of all, before I begin my remarks, I'd like to express my gratitude for the invitation, but also to make clear that I'm speaking here, of course, in my capacity as a representative of the World Jewish Congress and of the Israel Council on Foreign Relations, but the views that I'm about to express are mainly my own views, though I don't think many people in the Congress would probably disagree. I've been charged today with speaking about how European Jewry approaches the topic of our discussion, which I might also say is the kind of topic du jour. I've had the pleasure of being with Akiva and with a number of others here on such panels in the last year, and I think that's not insignificant. I think it's important to point out right away that when we're discussing what Jews think or don't think about a particular topic, we cannot put Jews all together and say they are some kind of a monolith and they all think the same way. But I will say I'm the product of a Jesuit education. I went to Georgetown University, and I remember one of our very beloved professors of economics, Father Zerini, used to tell us, gentlemen, in politics there is a right wing and there is a wrong wing. And we, at that time, I remember, were very amused by that. But I must say, Jews traditionally have not seen things just that way. For any number of reasons, Jews have traditionally been associated with liberal movements. And we can discuss the reasons why the right has generally not exercised tremendous powers of attraction for Jews, whether in Europe or elsewhere, which doesn't mean that you don't find Jews who support these movements. And I'm very grateful to our colleague, Mr. soon-to-be Dr. Raviv, for pointing out some of the nuances. And I think we have to be very careful of not falling into the trap of carelessly using terminology. Even, for example, when we saw in the presentation, very fine, the description of conservative Israelis, I was wondering what that means. I mean, I would say our president, Ruvi Ruvlin, is a very good example of the sort of conservative thinking, and he certainly didn't fit that rubric. At any rate, Jews in Europe are, for the most part, attracted by a kind of cosmopolitan worldview. And for the most part, they have not been drawn by parties that have preached a message of nativism or of intolerance, for all the reasons that you can understand, and for some of which have been elaborated on here. First of all, they see as a threat anything that would curtail their religious rights, and some of the parties that we have discussed have made it very clear that they don't see circumcision or ritual slaughter as being rights, and they are attempting actually in a number of countries to outlaw these practices. They are not turned on for the most part by the idea of Euroscepticism. Jews, I would say, were in the forefront of accepting the idea and of upholding the idea of the European Union, because they learned at cost what the alternatives might be, and therefore they are quite staunch believers, and all statistics indicate that upwards of 95% of European Jews are big believers in the European Union. But then, of course, there is also the historical memory, which is something that you cannot dismiss. Jews have traditionally felt themselves threatened by right-wing movements, and we could argue whether they're not also threatened by movements of the far left. Most certainly they are, but we're here to discuss the far right. And a part of the issue is that some of the parties discussed, I think even the Flammed Bloc has a certain historical heritage which one has to be careful about. There's a heavy historical baggage here. And the memory of the Shoah, we're talking about an event that still took place over 70 years ago, is still very strong in Europe, and it is still something that I would argue defines European Jewish identity. And all of these parties are guilty to one degree or another. I mean, we could perhaps isolate a few that are not, but for the most part are guilty of either obfuscation of the Holocaust or trivialization of the Holocaust. And so therefore, even when the leaders of some of these movements, whatever their motivation is, try to distance themselves from the past, it's not always seen as being something very sincere or very serious. Now, what has certainly changed the equation in more recent times is the introduction of Islamic-fueled or Islamicist-fueled anti-Semitism and the rising level of violence that can be seen throughout Western Europe. Eastern Europe is a different story simply because you don't have a very significant Muslim population. And there's no doubt that there is this fear in Europe, which to some extent has enabled right-wing parties to use this card, saying to European Jewry, look here, we are the only people who will come out and say that Islam in Europe poses a threat to the future of European Jewry, but most European Jews have simply not bought that, and they are very skeptical, for all the reasons that I've mentioned, of these parties. And I would say something else. Whatever the fear in European Jewish circles of Islam in its most radical variety, the idea that a particular ethnic, religious, or racial group would be scapegoated is something that most Jews look upon as being some kind of an anathema, and they don't want to associate themselves with it, even if they have palpable and well-founded fears. So I would argue that support for these groups is still at the moment rather a taboo among European Jews. They have not necessarily been convinced, and I would say they've not been convinced at all, when these parties have come forward and say, yes, but we are the only supporters of Israel today in Europe. They just don't buy it. And I can just give you as an example, I mean, a couple of months ago, there was an article by Knan Lipschitz in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, why these 5 European Jews are promoting far-right policies. And the very fact that these 5 people have been isolated, and there's a discussion, one in France, one in Britain, one in Sweden, one in Austria, and I'm missing one of the countries here, if you bear with me. So we've got Sweden, oh yes, and of course France, would indicate that that is not at all normative behavior. The fact that you headline that as being why these 5 European Jews are promoting far-right parties would be why is the dog chasing the man and not the other way around. So I think that's what has to be stressed if we want to understand what European Jewry today thinks about these parties. I think it's also important that people understand that European Jews have a close relationship with the State of Israel. That's very important to them. And I think for the most part they are quite satisfied by the, well, I would say uncompromising attitude of Israeli officialdom. And it doesn't mean that there haven't been here and there some Israelis who have been duped or have fallen into this trap. But Israeli officialdom has been very clear, and we've heard that from the representative of Israeli officialdom, that is the policy. And most European Jews, I think, appreciate that, and they have been used by Israeli officialdom to consult about how to understand this phenomenon. So I think I've been told that's it. That's the advantage of going last. Everything has been said, but not everything has been said by everyone. Yeah.
Thank you, Lauren, very much.
Sir.
As we say, last but not least, Mr. Ariel Mahama, diplomatic correspondent.
Everything has been said, but not everyone has said it.
And,
But Ariel would say something different.
Actually, you're right.
Ariel would
Or wrong.
present to us a different point of view, or we were hoping for that to have a discussion.
I'm not so sure.
Discussion. Should Israel rethink its attitude towards some right-wing populist parties in Europe? Please.
Oh, well, hello everyone. Maybe in this case I am the least because I'm not an expert to Europe politics or Europe extreme politics. What I do cover is Israeli diplomatic ties or arena, and that's why I know Akiva. Honestly, I'm not sure I have a lot to add to this discussion. what I can say, maybe a few comments, is that there is an effort, Akiva, by some senior Israeli politicians, at least regards FPO in Austria, to make some ties with this party, including ministers in the government. And as far as I know, with the legitimacy by the Prime Minister. I mean, he knew about those meetings, and it wouldn't have happened unless he gave his permission. That's about the FPO and the Strache. In more general perspective, at least in my point of view, there is no question that we can't legitimize any anti-Semitic or Nazi or neo-Nazi party in Europe, but and maybe it's not the headline of this discussion, but if our measure is anti-Semitism, then we have to check it on every parties in Europe. And as was mentioned here before, I don't think that our biggest problem or biggest anti-Semitic problem today is in the far right. I mean, what happened, the El-Quds Day last week in London and a few days before in Berlin. Okay, it's a famous bond between the leftists and the Muslims, or extreme Muslims in Europe, and probably people here know the facts better than I do. Or if we speak about the genocide denial, so as well, it doesn't come from one side. And in general, anti-Semitic in Europe didn't disappear, although what happened, and not only in the far right. So, of course, I won't legitimize those parties, and I won't legitimize any anti-Semitism. I will say, and if people will be interested, so later I'll tell the whole story, but I checked specifically the FPO. I made kind of research, 2 days visit in Vienna, including an interview with Mr. Strache to understand what his positions are. Personally, I'm persuaded today that he today is not anti-Semitic anymore. If he were in the past, I don't know, but at least today, I believe his honest views about Israel and about the Jewish people, and that he regrets what happened in the Holocaust and took responsibility for what happened in the Holocaust, etc. And again, if people are interested, I will tell the whole story afterwards. And you know, Akiva, that even in your ministry, there are some serious people who do recommend to give him a roadmap or checks, and really and honestly check if he can be legitimized or not. By the way, it's not only in Israel; it's including Mr. What's his name? In the Austrian Jewish community, I will remember his name in a minute, including no, Muzikant is against him, and I'm talking about. No, Lazar is in party. No, it's not the one. It's the casino. Just a minute. Martin Schlaf. Okay, Martin Schlaf supports him, but supports Strache. But another person, Israeli person, by the way, who recommended to the president, to President Rivlin, to make ties with Strache is Rafi Edan, who captured Eichmann. Okay, so it's not that easy. Last sentence, which actually I already said, or you know what, I'll put it this way. And I think we heard it in Akiva's statement as well. Today, Israel, if you want to speak honestly, Israel is mixing the moral position it has with the interest the state has, and it's definitely legitimate. But we have to really understand it, okay? Because as Akiva said very honestly, we do not legitimize, the state of Israel do not legitimize some parties because of the political price we might pay for it. Okay, but we just be very clear about it, that politics is one thing and morality is a different thing. And if we speak about morality, which means anti-Semitism, hate of Israel, hate of Jews, etc., then the problem is not only in the right wing, it's in the entire political map. Thank you.
So before we actually go to the questions and to the roundtable itself that we can converse one to another, I suggest we take a 10 minutes break for coffee and whatever. So there's some refreshments outside, and we reconvene at 6:45 exactly. Thank you.